Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Very nice to have people from far and wide. I hope that you're all seeing the slide in front of you, and hopefully it'll change slides. You'll let me know when I change it. Ostensibly, the original reason for having these two sessions, this one and next week, was to just orient ourselves to the trip that the congregation was invited to join me in October to Oxford. And this was a way to introduce us to the basics and the fundamentals of what we're going to see and hear about. But as people got interested in the topic in general, it became a free-for-all. So we're delighted to have people coming and people who are interested and will watch from afar. Some of you have received some background reading. There's people coming on the trip, and you may not have got to it yet, which is fine. And in many ways, this might be a good introduction to kind of deciding how you want to read the material, because you don't need to know everything. There's no test at the end, unlike my graduate students who always start off with, what is the test? What is the assessment? It's a very auspicious day because on July the 18th, 733 years ago, the Edict of Expulsion from Great Britain was issued by King Edward I. So we are almost to the day, 703 years ago, commemorating that edict. But thankfully, as we all know, that was not the end of the story. So I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning first.
Excuse me, Rabbi, could you say the year again?
It was 1290.
Oh.
733 years ago. I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. I invite you to interrupt with questions along the way for clarification particularly. And hopefully I'm going to leave some time, let's say in an hour, for any kind of discussion that we might want to have. Start off with the title. It's a very important title, and it's very carefully worded. And I'm following the Oxford Jewish historian, Mr. Cecil Roth. And for those of you who are coming to England, we're going to hear a lot about Mr. Cecil Roth, R-O-T-H. He called his book The Jews in England. And he did that particularly because he felt that we can't really call the medieval Jews British Jews or the Jews of England, because they were really French Jews who were residing in Britain. And as we know, it was about a 350-year history that took them from the time of the Normans, when William the Conqueror came to Britain in 1066, and they were expelled, as I said, in 1290. So when we talk about the Jews in England, we mean to say that they were living there, they were part of the country and part of the way in which the establishment was organized, particularly around the king, but they were not really integrated into society. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but we can't really say that they were British Jews. Now, that will all change when we get to the modern period, but for the medieval period, we're going to call them the Jews in England. And we're going to look at this period from 1066 to 1290, which is a whole block of time. And then we're going to skip forward to just 1 year, 1656. That seems a strange thing to do, but I wanted to kind of end this session on a high note rather than on a bad note. So let us begin with, the picture, of course, is a Jew of medieval England. It comes from one of the manuscripts of the time. You'll see the hat that the Jew is wearing is called the Jew hat. It is a hat that was required to be worn by the Jews so that they would be identified. And you will see that he's looking pretty disgruntled, but actually it's quite a favorable picture of a Jew. We're going to see non-favorable pictures of Jews, and this one is quite favorable. He looks kind of ordinary, and kind of well-dressed, heavy, thick clothes, and fairly long hair. So it's It's a picture of what you might call an ordinary person of the time. The Jews came to England because William the Conqueror, who was a Norman lord, had conquered Great Britain and had taken over from the Anglo-Saxons. William was an empire builder, and he wanted to institute a new way of developing the country. He was particularly interested in settling the country, not just conquering it and taking its assets and taking them back to France, where he came from, Normandy, but rather, really settling there and building up an infrastructure in the country. And he developed a whole series of castles and forts. He took over from the aristocracy of the country that was the Anglo-Saxon barons at the time, the lords, and he developed his own friends and relatives, the Norman knights, who took over the country. And really, it was a complete overhaul of the entire structure of the country. It became a French-speaking aristocracy that was ruling over an English-speaking populace. The populace consisted of peasants, some small landholders, and then these Anglo-Saxon lords and earls and barons who had been there quite a while, but who had been devastated by the Viking invasions of the 9th and the 10th century. So they were pretty tired out. And by the time the Normans got there, there was not much fight left in them. So you've all seen probably the movies with Errol Flynn and others who come sweeping in with their broadswords, and the Sheriff of Nottingham and Robin Hood, all those stories. That's the kind of period we're talking about. William needed money to build everything he wanted to build: monasteries, cathedrals, castles, and he needed loan of money, and he needed Jews to loan money. We have to understand that Jews in the Middle Ages were the only ones who could lend with interest. Christians were not allowed to lend money with interest. They could lend, but couldn't take any interest, so it wasn't worth their while. So Jews were left to be the only ones who were allowed to lend with interest. And although, in a sense, that made them very, very wealthy, on the other hand, it diminished them in the light of the people in Christian society. They were only dealing with money, and they were money lenders, and that was not considered kind of a noble profession. They were not allowed to take part in any other profession. They were not allowed to be members of the guilds. They could not do any other work except for a small retail householding, that kind of small holdings, a little bit of agriculture, but very, very little. Certainly in the urban areas, they could do almost nothing else. Jews came into England. They were very keen to be part of this new society, the Norman conquest, and they immediately settled in London and then spread out across the country. You see a map here of all of the communities where Jews lived. There were some very important ones like London, Oxford, Lincoln, which is up here. If I can show that with my cursor. Where's my cursor there? Lincoln, up there. Winchester down here, the old capital of Britain, the Anglo-Saxon capital. Down here in Norwich and East Anglia, that was a very important part of the country. And you'll notice that the settlements are really all shifted towards the east. And the reason for that, of course, was because their families and their relatives were living in France. So they were kind of, whenever they wanted to hop away or needed to leave, they could get a quick passage eastwards back to France or southwards back to France. So we're talking mainly about Jewish populations in the southeast of England. And they were doing very well. They were welcomed into society. And quite quickly, again, looking for my cursor. Here we go. There was a charter that was created by Henry I. We don't have a copy of the charter, but it describes, later on, it's described as to what this charter consisted of. This particular document is a confirmation of the charter. I'll just read a few of the words here. I don't know if you can read them from the screen. I don't know if it's big enough for you, but let me just give you a sense of it. We grant, this is the king, we grant to all the Jews of England and Normandy, so they're considered one community, England and Normandy, to have freely and honorably to have residence in our land and to hold all that from us, which they held from King Henry, our father's grandfather. So this is later on. And all that now they reasonably hold in land and fees and mortgages and goods and all their liberties and customs, just as they had in the time of King Henry. And if any dispute, this is number 2, if any dispute arise between a Christian and a Jew, he who summons the other to answer his complaint should have witnesses. There should be a lawful Christian and a lawful Jew. And number 3, when a Jew dies, his body should not be detained above earth, but his heirs shall have his money and his debts. So this charter for the Jews was, in a sense, to make them feel comfortable in the land in which they were residing, this new land. They were to have all the rights and privileges that was given to them by the king. It was not to be taken away from them. And as you can also see, their religious rights were to be honored as well. So if they died, as we know, the Jewish practice is that you bury as soon as possible, and the rights of that burial to be buried as quickly as possible was confirmed by the king as well. So this kind of goes to show how important the Jews were to the king. And we know that in these medieval times, the Jews were considered servants of the crown. In Latin, this is called servi camerae. It means that the Jews were answerable only to the crown, not to the local sheriffs, not to the local bishops or earls, but only to the crown, which had 2 components to this. One was that, of course, the crown then could really control the Jews and control the finances of the Jewish moneylenders. They could insist on the interest they were charging. They could release people from debts if they wanted to do that, and often they did. Or indeed, they could punish the Jews and tax them and take money away from them whenever they wanted to as well. So the Jews, in a sense, were completely in the service of the king. And on the one hand, this was protection, because you couldn't do anything to a Jew because he was kind of the king's property, a bit like the king's deer or the king's swans. If you know about the story of the swans in England are owned by the queen. Well, now the king. But the Jews were in the same category. Now, in a feudal society, you basically have 2 classes. You have the upper class and the peasant. The Jews were neither. They were not the upper class and they were not the peasant. They were in the middle. So if you like, they were the beginning of the middle class. And this is a very important role that they play. There is a book by a French historian called Pirenne about the development of medieval cities. And it says that really the medieval Jew was the first one who really gave the sense of a middle class to urban society in Europe. Without the Jew, you wouldn't have had a middle class. So in a sense, they begin to develop this new class, but it's a very dangerous place to be, because if you're not the aristocracy, then you have no power. If you're not the peasant, then you're not going to be protected by your local people who know, what you can do for them. So loyalty is a very difficult thing. And as soon as there's a problem between the king and the people, or between the king and the barons, or between the king and the church, or indeed between the king and the Pope, the Jews are in the middle and they get it in the neck every single time. So that is kind of not the place you necessarily want to be, but you have no choice. So that's where the Jews had to be situated. Let's move on to Oxford. Now, Jews came to Oxford in 1075. So we're talking about 10 years after William the Conqueror invaded Britain. Just 10 years later, they come out of London looking for places to live, and they come to Oxford. This is the city of Oxford. It's the middle of the city of Oxford. Here is a crossroads called Carfax. if anyone's been to Oxford, this is the center of the city of Oxford. It's a tower that's left there. It was the wall of the tower of the city. And this road down here was called Great Jewry. Great Jewry was the place where the Jews lived in medieval Oxford. When we go there, we're going to have a walking tour of this area. This black area here was the synagogue, and all of these houses were owned by Jews. Today, this is called St. Aldate. It is the main thoroughfare. It's the shopping street, the main shopping street of Oxford. If you go north from Carfax, you get to the place where we're going to be staying, and indeed the place where the current synagogue is today. But this whole area after 1290 was sold. Obviously, the Jews, when they were expelled, they had to sell all their properties, and they were sold to the Oxford colleges. So these are now in all part of Oxford colleges. Christ Church College, Balliol College, all were medieval Oxford colleges, and they own this land now. They, in their records, they still have the deeds that they bought these lands from Jews from 1290. And I don't know if we're going to be able to see those, but they are part of the record. You can see that Jews did live in a concentrated area, not because it was a ghetto. It was not a ghetto. Ghettos did not come into Europe until much later in Venice. But the Jews wanted to be together, and they wanted to walk to shul, like many Jews do. So they settled near each other. We also know that Jews lived in stone houses, not wooden houses. And we'll come back to the reason for that in a minute. They were the only people who lived in stone houses, and any medieval stone houses still exist today were Jewish houses. There was quite improvement on the houses that people regularly lived in. Here's the first record of a Jew in Oxford, 1075. This is a contemporary historian, medieval English historian, writing about the first Jew in Oxford. About this time, I find the Jews settled, and their number great in Oxford. We don't know the number, but great probably means, maybe a couple of hundred people, or maybe, 30 to 40 families. Because in several scripts or in several letters, it appears, particularly that of Brunum le Riche, a French name, obviously, like we were talking earlier about French names. This is a French name, made to the said church of St. George in its first foundation, by which giving to the canons thereof land in Walton, in the northern suburb of Oxford, warrant it to them against Jews, meaning that there was a guarantee that the land would not be transferred to Jews, and therefore effectively to the crown, because the Jews, if they owned the land, for instance, against a debt that the church might have owed them, if they held the land in mortgage, then should anything happen to the Jews, the king would then take the land away from the church. So again, this is a dispute between king and church, in which the Jews are in the middle. First of all, the suburb of Walton still exists. It's where my sister lives. She has a house in Walton, so she's probably sitting on top of a plot of land that Jews may have held in debt for the church in 1075. So all very exciting. We have at the bottom of this page a mention of Jews in the Domesday Book. The Domesday Book, as you may know, was a record that the kings of England wanted to gather of all the information, in fact, the finances of every single landowner in the country. And they mentioned it's basically the first poll of everybody. And in the Domesday Book, there are several Jews that are mentioned. Here we have some medieval illustrations of Jews. This is Moshe Mocha, or Moses Mocha. He lives in Norwich. He is 1233, and he's wearing a Jew hat. Maybe the spike is a little bit exaggerated. It looks like a First World War German army helmet, doesn't it? But again, it's quite a nice caricature. He was a very wealthy man and had 4 daughters, all who did very well. these financiers are making a ton of money. They're the wealthiest people in the land in terms of cash, and they're lending to kings and bishops for the building of monasteries and castles and cathedrals. So many cathedrals, Lincoln Cathedral, St. Albans Cathedral, Norwich Cathedral, are all funded by Jewish money. We'll see later that Westminster Abbey also is funded by a Jewish person as well. And they become quite well known in English society. They're illustrated in documents and manuscripts. So, there's a picture of them, if you like, in the press. You might think of this as the, newspaper of the time, and that they would be recognized and known about. As I say, they are serving the king, and it's a good life for the first part of the century, in which they in the 12th century. We have his wife, Abigail, or in Latin, Abigail. And here she, again, looking quite swish, fashionable, wearing the latest fashion on her head, what's called a coif and a wimple, and got braided hair in the latest French design, I suppose. And this actually is part of a wooden, it's an engraving, it's part of a pediment of a building in which they are both illustrated almost as if they were, celebrities of the time. I talked about the stone houses. These are the kind of houses they lived in. This is the house of Belazes from the town of Lincoln, which is just above Cambridge, as you saw, on the eastern side of England, almost to the northern extremity of where Jews were living. You can see how well constructed it is and well fortified. And this was one of the reasons why they were building stone houses. These houses were pretty difficult to get into. They were solid. You will have reference to this in Ivanhoe that you're all going to be reading when we talk about Ivanhoe. And indeed in The Merchant of Venice, there's reference to these stone houses and how the houses can be shut up against the mob. And they had to be many times. The mob came round regularly around Easter time in order to persecute the Jews, who would either shut themselves up in their houses, or indeed they would find themselves very much located near either the cathedral or the local noble's palace. And if they had the right protection, and they'd probably purchased that protection, then they could hide in a bishop's palace or a local nobleman's palace while the mob went by. Didn't always work, of course, and certainly there were many, many massacres in Britain. As the 12th century rolls on, things get worse and worse for the Jews. As we move from the Henrys and the Williams, we actually have the start of a civil war in Britain between Stephen and Matilda. These are children and wives of previous kings, and a civil war, again, as we heard previously, creates a situation where the Jews get stuck in the middle, and they have to decide which side they're going to participate in. And particularly in Oxford, the Jews side with Stephen. Tragically, he's on the losing side. So as soon as Matilda's forces come to Oxford, they massacre the Jews, take over their houses, because they were just betting on the wrong horse. So it is a difficult time as the century moves on. The protection that they thought they had under this charter that we saw earlier seems to be less prevalent as things move on. Bob, did you have a question?
I did. Is Matilda a woman?
Matilda is a woman, yes. She is the daughter of Henry I, and she's challenging her nephew, Stephen, for the crown. It's an early civil war, and it's a bloody one. And in the end, Matilda wins out. We do find, however, in this period just before the time that the protection is eroded, that Jews are doing quite well. And we do find some famous things happening in Jewish life that are part of Anglo Jewry. For instance, Abraham ibn Ezra, who you may know is one of the most famous biblical commentators, next to Rashi. He's probably the most famous. He comes to England from the continent, and he settles in England, and he writes his commentary on the book of Genesis and Exodus while he's living in England. And he writes about the fog in London while he's writing his biblical commentary. So you can read about the fog in London in his biblical commentary. So obviously it was going on at that time as well. You also have a man called Yom Tov. He came again from the continent, settled in Britain, and he writes poetry, religious poetry. Some of that poetry we use in our High Holy Day services to this very day. And he lived and died in England. So we're getting a little bit of kind of creativity from the Jewish community, some religious innovation, some religious liturgy and writing. So it's a community that's flourishing. Their families, they're growing, the numbers are growing, and the number of communities are spreading. Synagogues are growing, and they seem to be worshiping in peace up until we get to the beginning of the 13th century, 1200s, when things start to deteriorate. And we can talk a little bit about why that might be, and why this, what's called the milk cow, the Jews who were serving the community so well, particularly the aristocracy, they were serving them so well. Why does it suddenly go bad? And what turns the king and the nobles away from the money that they need for the building of the institutions? Did the slide just change? Yes. So for those of you coming to Oxford, I'm not going to talk a lot about this woman. She's probably the most remarkable woman, not the lady on the right, the lady on the left. Licoricea, I think that's how you pronounce it. Licoricea, maybe. She's probably the most remarkable woman in medieval England, Jewish or not Jewish. She is a woman who stands out. She's a businesswoman. She marries 2 or 3 times. She inherits a vast fortune, and she's the one who rebuilds Westminster Abbey when it needs to be reconstructed by the Normans. And Westminster Abbey is probably due entirely to her. She lives part of her time in Oxford, so we'll hear about her in Oxford. She marries a man called David in Oxford, but she also lives in Winchester. And you'll see in the middle of the picture here, a new statue. It just went up last year of Licoricea. It's in Winchester, and I went to see it last summer. It's a statue of probably the most famous resident of Winchester, maybe apart from Alfred the Great, who lived there. And people, of course, knew nothing about her until last year. She's been spread all over the news and the BBC, and people have done documentaries. And there is a book about her now, and it's been written by this historian. Her name is Rebecca Abrams. That's the lady on the right. Rebecca Abrams is one of my congregants from Oxford. And she will be talking to us about her book when we go. So we're going to have first-hand knowledge of Licoricea. Yeah, Bob.
Who is the child with Licoricea in this statue?
Great. Very good question. It's not a great picture, sorry, of the statue. And if you go to Google, you'll get better pictures. This was her son. As I say, at the high point of Anglo Jewry, she was a multimillionaire. By the time her son grows up, and we have records of what happens to him, he gets imprisoned for bankruptcy because obviously the king steals all of their money, and he's bankrupt in a debtor's jail and debtor's prison, and he comes to a poor end, I'm afraid. So here he is as a little boy, enjoying playing through the streets of Winchester, but unfortunately he comes to a bad end.
What's the bad end?
Oh, he's murdered in jail. Yeah. Now, one of the lowest points of Anglo Jewry is what's called the blood libel accusation. What's really tragic and really despicable is that it was Britain that established the blood libel. It was the first instance of it. As you will know, it was an accusation that Jews killed children at the time of Passover, that they took their blood and they turned them into matzah. And the original accusation was from Norwich in 1144. Of course, that libel continued right up until the 20th century, and most famously appeared again in the end of the 19th century, the late 1800s in Syria, and was really a horrendous libel and persisted for such a very, very long time. So it's really to Britain's discredit that this libel began. So you'll see here from the Chronicles in the middle of the page, I'll just read this little bit from about William of Norwich. Now will we say something what befell in King Stephen's time. In his time, the Jews of Norwich brought a Christian child before Easter and tortured him with all the tortures wherewith our Lord was tortured, and on Long Friday, that's Good Friday, hanged him on a rood, that's a cross, in hatred of our Lord, and afterwards buried him. They thought it would be concealed, but our Lord showed that he was a holy martyr. And the monks took him and buried him honorably in the monastery. And through our Lord, he makes wonderful and manifold miracles. And he is now Saint William. So the little boy becomes a saint. He is venerated in the Norwich Cathedral until 1927. And he becomes a saint, and there is a shrine dedicated to him in Norwich Cathedral until in 1927 a plaque replaces the shrine. You can go there now and see it. And it says that this was a despicable libel. The Jews were not to blame for this death, and that Christianity should be ashamed of what it did. So there is some acknowledgement today that this was a libel against the Jews, but of course, it didn't take away from the fact that this was an increasingly deteriorating situation for Anglo Jews in here from 1144 and moving into the 12th century. Now we have some caricatures that are different. This is Aaron of Lincoln. You begin to see the hooked nose, less, well dressed. Wearing a hood, looking a little bit more devilish. And in fact, the Latin is Aaron from the devil. You'll also see at the bottom of the picture on his tunic, there is an emblem. This is 2 tablets of the law. These are the 10 Commandments. And this is the Jew badge. In medieval England, the Jew badge, which was authorized by 1215 by the Fourth Lateran Council, the Pope decided by 1215 that Jews must wear an identifying badge across the whole of Europe. In some countries, that was a yellow badge. In some countries, it was a circle. In Venice, it was a yellow circle. If you watch Medici, the Netflix program, you'll see in the court, in the consistory, you'll see Jews wearing a yellow circle. That Medici and the Netflix series is so wonderful, it's so accurate. But in England, it was 2 tablets of the stone that were the Jew badge, and that was how they were identified. So whenever you're looking at documents, and we will be going to the Bodleian Library looking at manuscripts, we'll be looking out for the Jew badge to see how Jews were identified. If not the Jew badge, then the Jew hat. So it was one or the other. You can see here he's not wearing that hat that we saw earlier. He's wearing the badge.
And Rabbi, what was the circle? What was the meaning of the circle that people wore?
Not sure why a circle. Actually, don't know. Good question. Be interesting to know more about that. If anyone knows or wants to look that up. We get now to the city of York. We're now in 1190. King Richard I is on the throne. You'll know Richard the Lionheart. And he's crowned in London, but he immediately leaves for the Crusades. The Crusades are a devastating time for Jews throughout Europe. The first Crusade was in 1096. The Jews in England were pretty much saved from any persecution in the first Crusade because the British aristocracy were not really involved in the first Crusade. But by the time we get to the third Crusade, King Richard I, the Lionheart, is the one who leads the third Crusade. And at his coronation, there is a massacre of Jews by accident, quote unquote. The Jews come to London to provide a bribe, so to speak, to the king on his coronation. Obviously, they want to make sure that the new king will uphold the charter that Henry I had instituted. But instead of the king upholding the charter, there seems to have been an unavoidable massacre of Jews in London. And King Richard, after the massacre and after those debts that the Jews held were cancelled, King Richard apologizes to the Jews. So we don't quite know really, were some people just trying to get out of paying the Jews back? In 1190, so that's just a year after the coronation, in the city of York, Jews are being chased by the mob. They flee to Clifford's Tower. As I said earlier, often they'll flee to a place of rescue. Clifford's Tower was owned by the bishop and was a pretty safe place. As you can see, it's on a hill. It was pretty safe to be there. There were 250 Jews hiding in the tower, but the mob besieged the tower. They wouldn't let them out. And tragically, like the story of Masada, the Jews decided to martyr themselves. So they killed themselves in the tower. 250 Jews died. There were a few who were left, but when they came out of the tower, they were killed by the mob. So pretty much devastating the Jewish community of York. Again, nothing was done about that until the 1960s, when the chief rabbi unveiled a plaque on the hill. You can go there today, and there's a plaque that commemorates the massacre. I talked about this once in a sermon. I don't know if anyone remembers that. My son, Micah, took some friends to see the plaque this past year, non-Jewish friends, and they all were astonished to read what had happened there, to remember this. And Micah said, "Oh, don't worry about it. It happens to us all the time." So that's kind of that message. So we are definitely in a low point of Jews in England, as we said earlier. And of course, this is probably one of the lowest points, when the Jews have to massacre themselves rather than be forcibly converted or be killed. Now, what's happening in terms of the financing is that the king creates what's called the exchequer. Today we have the Chancellor of the Exchequer in England, and that is a derivation of a term that was created for Jewish money. The Exchequer is a place where records are kept of who owes the Jews money and the deeds of land that is mortgaged to the Jews, or indeed cathedrals and monasteries. And all of that there are two copies kept. One copy is kept in Latin by the king, in what's called the Star Chamber. The Star Chamber is a place in Westminster Palace that is still there today. It's still called the Star Chamber. Star is a Hebrew word meaning document. Shtar is a word, and today the place, if you've been to Westminster Palace, there's a chamber called the Star Chamber, not because it looks like a star, but because the Hebrew word shtar, meaning document, was where they kept the documents of the Jewish records. And the other copy was kept by the Jewish person in their stone houses in Hebrew, which is why the mob was always looking to try and get into those houses to destroy the records. That was, in the main, economic reasons were, in the main, the reasons why the aristocracy wanted to start to create a situation where they no longer had to owe money to the Jews. Of course, the mob, the peasants, were riled up by the church and by religious hatred. So you had economic hatred and religious hatred working against Jews at the same time. And that was, of course, a devastating situation. We come to Magna Carta, most famous for King John, 1215. There are 2 paragraphs in Magna Carta about Jews. And what's happening here is that there is like a resurgence of the opportunity for Jews to be protected again by the king and by the barons. So I won't read it all, but it's a protective device by which the king and the barons agree. You know, we don't really want any more disorder. We really do not need the mob chasing Jews around the streets. It's not good for the economy. It's not good for stable society. Let's kind of agree that we'll just keep the Jews kind of in place. We're not going to aggrandize them, but we're not going to chase after them afterwards. What's ironic is that as you probably know, the Magna Carta is copied a number of times in subsequent generations, and these 2 paragraphs are left out of subsequent writings, copies of the Magna Carta. There's a copy of the Magna Carta in various places in America. I think there's one in Washington. There's one at the Bible Museum, if you've been there in Washington, one of the original copies. But they don't mention these paragraphs. This is the only way you can see this is if you go to Salisbury Cathedral, which is the kind of the original. So we're beginning to see new restrictions on the Jews. I'll just read some of these new restrictions. No Jew should remain in England unless you do the king's service. From the hour of birth, every Jew, whether female or male, should serve us in some way, and that there be no synagogues of the Jews in England, save in those places in which such synagogues were there in the time of King John, the king's father. And that in these, this is now Henry III. And in that these synagogues, the Jews, one and all, should subdue their voices in performing their ritual office. Christians may not hear them. And that all Jews answer to the rector of the church in the parish in which they dwell, touching all Jews parochial relating to their houses. No Christian nurse should in future suckle or nourish a male child of any Jew, nor any Christian man or woman serve any Jew or Jewess, or eat with them or tarry in their houses. No Jew or Jewess eat or buy meat in Lent. No Jew disparage the Christian faith or publicly dispute concerning the same. No Jew have secret familiar intercourse with any Christian woman. No Christian man with a Jewess, and every Jew wear his badge conspicuously on his breast. This tells us 2 things. First of all, that these restrictions are being imposed, not unfamiliar to the 1933 Nuremberg laws. If you've read those, they are very well similar worded. But also it tells us that all the things that they are trying to restrict happened before. So we know that in the good times, Jews and Christians did meet together. There were Christian women who were acting as wet nurses. There were people who were socializing together. People would, visit each other's houses. That there was sexual intercourse between Jew and non-Jew. There was intermarriage, and all the things they're trying to stop are all the things that were happening before. So it kind of reminds us that when people enact laws, it's because they want to stop what they think is happening. And I'll pause there because we now get to the point where Edward I, who is comes into to be king in the late 13th century, 1270s. He also rules over England and France, or part of France. And he spends a lot of his time in France. And he decides when he comes back to England that the Jews don't warrant his attention anymore. First of all, they've been bankrupt by the aristocracy, who have stolen and taxed them to the point where they no longer have the wealth they had a century earlier, that they are now, if you like, a drain on the royal purse, because the royal household has to keep them if they are bankrupt. If they're penniless, no one else is going to look after them. They're also accused of something called coin clipping. You may know about this. Coins in medieval Europe were made of precious metal, silver, brass, gold even. And what people would do is they would cut little pieces off the end in order to melt down the pieces and turn them into either coinage or jewelry. And Jews were accused of clipping these coins. And it might be the case that they were. We certainly have court cases where Jews are brought up before the courts for doing this and being found guilty. Some of it may have been prejudice, some of it may have been real. But by 1290, as I said, 773 years ago, on July the 18th, which was, in the Jewish calendar, Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av. And if you'll know your Jewish history, you'll know that the 9th day of Av was the day which has always been considered a day of memorial and of destruction in Jewish history. It was the day when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple, and the day on which the Romans destroyed the second temple. It's the day in which the edict of expulsion was made by Edward I, probably on purpose. He probably knew enough to know that this was a solemn day in the Jewish calendar. He wanted to kind of punish the Jews, and they were expelled. They were sent across back to France, where they had come. They were pretty poor at that point. They were penniless. There's all kinds of records about having, not unlike the refugees who are crossing the Mediterranean, they had to go in boats that were unworthy. Lots of them were drowned. There were captains who were unsavory and took their money and just drowned the ships. It was really, the end of Anglo Jewry. And it was not long, actually, before the rulers in France then also decided to expel the Jews from France, and they became the wandering Jews around Europe, and ironically made their way to Poland, which is a whole nother part of Jewish history. Let's pause there. Any questions as we come to the end of this kind of medieval period? Bob?
You say that they were cast out because they wanted to punish the Jews. What did they say they were punishing them for?
Right. So again, you'll see in the records that there are both economic and religious reasons. The church was in the ascendancy. The Catholic Church wanted this kind of heathen unbeliever out of its midst. As I said, the Fourth Lateran Council had been promulgated, which was the Pope had decided that Jews were now infidels and no longer kind of a sister religion. All kinds of reasons, religious reasons why Christianity wanted them gone from all Christian lands. And if you wanted to be a Christian prince, you wanted to get rid of your Jews, and it happened all over Europe. The economic reasons were that they had been drained dry. They were no longer useful to the king. They no longer had the cash that they'd had a century earlier. And in a sense, they had nothing else to do. So why keep them? Because you pretty much had to pay for them because they had no other form of income. So you might as well get rid of them. They could have all been murdered. They weren't. They were, the ones that were not drowned at sea or, cheated at the beaches did get to France. And we have records, of course, of Jews from England who then went abroad. And some people have show their ancestry from those Jews. But it was the end of a whole community, and pretty destructive time. Yeah. Jennifer.
The Moors aren't mentioned right now, during the Gilded Age. Is that considered later, before 1492? Or, I thought the Gilded Age was somewhere around now, or was it following when near the time of 1492?
You'll get to what's called the Golden Age of Spain and Portugal. That will be a little later. That will be around the 14th century, around 1300. That's when Jews in Spain are doing very well. But not unlike the story we've just told, the situation in Spain and Portugal will decline until 1492, when they will be expelled from Spain and Portugal, which is a much, much bigger expulsion. When we talk about the numbers expelled from Britain in 1290, probably around 3,000. Some say maybe 4,000, but probably about 3,000 people were expelled around that time. When we get to 1492 and the expulsion from Spain, we're talking about 250,000 Jews. We're talking about a whole population on the move, much like the Syrian population today, or in the last 5 years. So it's a very different level of expulsion, and the Anglo community was never large, and at its height, probably not more than maybe 20,000 people, of which by the end there were probably only about 3,000 or 4,000 left.
On a separate note, from the history you've described, right from the beginning, there was anti-Semitism. So even though they got along, they were they had to wear the hats, that discriminated against them. They could only serve as lenders of money and couldn't go into other fields. So the anti-Semitism was rampant, it feels like. Even in good, so-called good times.
Yeah, I mean, think over the 3,000 history of the Jewish people, we've definitely seen that. I think historians, and it would be interesting to ask people that when we go to Oxford what they think about this. We're going to meet with a historian called Jonathan Romaine. The documents that I'm showing you tonight are from his book. He's reproduced the original documents in his book. We're going to meet with him, and we're going to ask him how much he thinks that anti-Semitism is a consistent thread in Anglo Jewry, or how much it goes up and down. And I think, from my understanding, that there are certainly times when the Christian communities, not necessarily the leaders, but the people who are identifying as being friends with Jews, there are people who are marrying Jews. Those people feel that there is, a love between Jew and Christian, and they're trying to show that love. And philo-Semitism goes hand in hand with anti-Semitism. Now, I think that we can show that in many places where times go up and down. At the time, there are times when, for instance, in America, we've seen philo-Semitism, when people really welcome Jews, and then anti-Semitism. So I think we have to understand that these things go hand in hand, and sometimes they're in the ascendancy one way or another. I don't want to end, however, without coming to...
and Rabbi, I think there's one more question. Dick Daynard had a question.
Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, my question is, you said at the height, before 1290, there were maybe 20,000 Jews, but only about 3,000 or 4,000 they were expelled. The difference is, were these people, presumably there were some people who were killed, but doesn't sound like there were 16,000 who were killed. So did they leave more or less voluntarily before then? So
yeah,
seeing a handwriting on the wall.
They knew where their bread was buttered, and they left. Many left. Now, the reason we know that actually is because I mentioned earlier Henry III, who was just before Edward I. Edward I was the Edward I was the king who expelled them. His father, Henry III, was petitioned by the Jews to leave the country. They felt like there was no point in them staying. They were just being persecuted. Why should they stay? And he refused to let them leave, which again suggests that many had left and that they wanted to leave. And this was a last-ditch effort to try and get the last lot out. At that point, he refused. Not sure why he refused at that point, but in a sense, I'm not going to let my Jews leave. They're mine. I'm going to keep them. That then with his son Edward I, then they are expelled. These kings, blew hot and cold, and they also sometimes they blew the economic message. We're going to make use of these Jews despite what the church says. And sometimes they listened to the church and they said, no, the church is right. These are infidels and we should get rid of them, and not listen to the moneylenders and the people who are receiving the money. So there actually happens to be one of the answers to my earlier question is why the deterioration, particularly on the economic side, because the Italians suddenly decide to start lending money at interest. And there's a group called the Lombards. You may have heard of the Lombards. They start lending money at interest. And they're Christian. So no longer do we need Jews. They're not the only people. There's competition in the marketplace now. The Lombard banks are opening up in London. You don't need the Jews anymore. So there's kind of there's no longer a monopoly on lending at interest. Okay, I want to definitely get to the last part of the story, which of course is the beginning of a whole new story. It's too tragic to end at 1290. So by the time we get to 1656, a lot later, the world has changed. First of all, we no longer have a monarchy in England. We now have a republic. So that's number one. And it's really important to remember that because the Jews were expelled by a king, not by parliament. It was sovereign power that expelled them. So the question that arises in 1656, when the question is posed, who can let them back in? Who has the right? Who has the responsibility? We don't have a king anymore. So how do you can't revoke a royal edict because there are no more kings. So what has to happen? It's a constitutional crisis. And it's a really big crisis, not just about the Jews, but about all royal edicts. And you'll see when we get to the end of the story that actually...
You just silenced yourself. Rabbi, you just silenced yourself accidentally.
There you go. Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
This is after the expulsion from Spain. This is after the Civil War in Britain. Oliver Cromwell is now in charge of the Republic. And there are no Jews in Britain. We do know there are what are called Portuguese merchants. We would call them Marranos. They're hiding in London. We know that they're Jews, but nobody else does. And they don't want anybody to know that either. So when we say that Shakespeare never met a Jew, it's probably right. He never met a Jew in England. I think we were talking about this before when we discussed The Merchant of Venice, but he was in Europe. So he did meet Jews outside of England. Christopher Marlowe, who wrote The Jew of Malta, definitely met Jews. And he also knew that Portuguese merchants were Marranos and were living in secret when he wrote The Jew of Malta. So it's not true to say that there were no Jews at all. There were certainly times when Marrano merchants were a little bit more identified maybe as not so secret Jews. And there were times when they were more secret. We know that Queen Elizabeth had a Jewish doctor who obviously didn't identify as Jewish. His name was Lopez, which is a Jewish name. And he was considered a bit of a magician as well, his strange character. But anyway, let's pretend there are no Jews between 1290 and this moment in 1656 at the end of the Civil War when Oliver Cromwell is taking over the head of the government. And we come across a very strange story. And this whole restoration of Jews in Britain is shrouded in lots of mystery. It's a little bit miraculous, actually. It comes with a little taste of God's miracle, because the first thing we hear about is that there's a record of a man called Montesinos. Montesinos goes to Brazil. He's a Spanish adventurer, and he goes to Brazil, and he goes to a native Brazilian village, and he asks the people of the village, "Who are you?" in Portuguese, and they answer in Hebrew. Montesino happens to be a Marrano, so he knows Hebrew. And he says to them, "Why are you speaking Hebrew?" And they say, "We are Hebrews." And he says, "Well, prove that you're Hebrews." So they recite the Shema to him. And he's amazed that people in Brazil in 1650 are of Hebrew descent and are reciting Hebrew, and that they're Jewish. He writes a report to the King of Portugal and Spain, and this report travels Europe, and it gets into the hands of a very mercurial and strange individual by the name of Manasseh ben Israel, who is also Marrano, living in Amsterdam. Now, if you happen to know your history, you'll know that Spain owned what are called the lowlands, but this was just the moment when Spain was when the lowlands, that is Holland, was breaking free of Spain, and there was beginning to be a civil war between Holland and Spain, and Holland was turning towards Luther and Lutheranism, and Spain obviously was continuing to be Catholic. Manasseh ben Israel was a Catholic Marrano who then, when Holland became free of Spain, admitted that he was actually Jewish. He was a scholar of Jewish life. He lived down the road from Rembrandt, and he was painted by Rembrandt on the canal. I don't know if this is the Rembrandt picture or not. I can't remember. Does anyone know if this is Rembrandt, Bob?
Would you define Marrano as a secret Jew? Is that what that means?
Secret Jew, yeah. So once the Holland broke away from Spain and the Inquisition was no longer in control, then the Jews could admit themselves to being Jewish, and they did. It's a miracle that Jews from 1492 all the way to 1650 had kept their Judaism in secret. It's it's like 3 generations, not unlike the refuseniks in Russia in our own time. It went like, your parents didn't do anything Jewish, but you just about remembered your grandparents lighting candles, maybe behind closed curtains. Lots of stories about Marranos in Mexico and other places in Brazil who have stories like that. One of the members of my conversion class at CRT is a Brazilian convert, so Marrano, and he is in the conversion class because he wants to now get Jewish status restored to him. Anyway, lots of stories.
Just one question. What is the derivation of the word Marrano?
Yes, really good question. I believe it means pig in Portuguese. So it's a derogatory term that people called the secret Jews. So if you knew your neighbor was a secret Jew, on Friday night, they drew the curtains and lit 2 candles and baked bread, you call them pig. It was a derogatory term. Marrano.
By the way, I don't think
a lot of the historians now are not using the word Marrano because of that. There's it's what they're calling a contested term. If you read some of the books about that era and the next, there are different words now that are being used rather than Marrano because it means pig and because it was derogatory.
That's right, Jane. Thank you. And
could I ask you a question?
We should use the word converso, which I think is the accent.
Yeah. And by the way, unless Rembrandt signed his portraits in Hebrew, I don't think this is a signature.
Actually, it says Rembrandt in.
Does it?
There's
Yes.
Rembrandt. 16th
I thought it was Hebrew. I thought it was
No.
looking at
No, it
Hebrew
says
letters in there.
Yeah.
Rembrandt.
Well,
Yeah.
It's Rembrandt.
it looks
Okay.
like a Rembrandt. Could I ask a question? The only other time I ever thought of the name Murano was in buying Venetian glass, Murano Venetian glass. Is there any connection between the two uses of the word Murano?
I think that's spelled differently, Steve.
Yeah, it's spelled differently. I don't think so. It's
Okay.
Different spelling, Murano.
No,
yeah.
Genetics kill you every time. Thank you.
So
Is-
just to go back to the map for a second, Jennifer. What we see here is England is isolated from Europe. There's been a civil war. There's been a disconnection between England and the rest of the continent. What we in England call Little Britain. Whereas England had been very much part of the continent in medieval times, had very much been part of the continent. It was standing alone as a Protestant kingdom, amongst Catholic Spain and Catholic France. But now that Holland becomes Protestant, suddenly England and Holland, obviously it's a natural alliance. So we're beginning to see how Jews might see England as a favorite place to go to. As Jews were looking for places to go, after the expulsion from Spain and Portugal, they were looking for places to go. Now, the New World was an opportunity. So there were Jews who definitely wanted to come to the New World. And by 1650, we have Jews in New York, we have Jews in Rhode Island, obviously not in Massachusetts. Those pilgrims kept us out. But so Jews are now traveling the whole wide world to look for places to live. Manasseh ben Israel is, as I say, he's kind of a mercurial figure. He's a maverick. He's not looked upon with favor by the community in Amsterdam because he wants to be a leader of settling Jews wherever he can find a place for Jews to settle. He's like trying to be the Hebrew, Hayas. He's trying to be the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society all on his own. He's looking for places for Jews to live, and he turns to England and to Oliver Cromwell in particular, and he says, now that you're a Protestant kingdom, not a kingdom, you're a Protestant Commonwealth, no kings to worry about. We want to come back. And he gives two reasons why Jews should come to England. The first one is economic, and that goes back to, it's almost like that mode that we've had through the medieval period. The economic question becomes important, not as moneylenders anymore, but for other economic reasons. And I'll just read the three reasons that Manasseh ben Israel says that Jews should live in England. Three things, if it please your highness, that make a strange nation well beloved among the nations of a land. So a strange nation being the Jews. And the three things are, number one, profit that people will receive from them. So again, not money lending, but trade. So profit. Number two, fidelity. We're pretty good at being loyal to the people who look after us. Fidelity that they hold towards their princes. We've demonstrated that we have been loyal to princes. And then thirdly, the nobleness and purity of their blood. That is, we're a good people. We act well. We look after our own. We don't intermarry. We don't evangelize. We look after ourselves. We're the chosen people in that sense. We're worthy of your interest, your highness, meaning Oliver Cromwell. And he writes a petition to Oliver Cromwell about this economic argument. But he then does something very clever, because he knows that Oliver Cromwell is not the only one he has to persuade. Cromwell, by the way, is a Philo-Semite, meaning he's in favor of Jews in Great Britain. He's an Old Testament scholar. He loves the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. Oliver Cromwell is like, an Old Testament prophet. So there's no problem there. But Manasseh ben Israel realizes that he can't just appeal to the economic argument. He has to appeal to the religious argument too, because the church and the Church of England, which is now operating, and all things. Sorry, no, not the Church of England. The Catholic Church still. He has to persuade that this is part of a destiny that is being foreseen. And he comes up with another argument, which is in a second document. And he says, I have conceived that our universal dispersion was a necessary circumstance to be fulfilled. So he's drawing upon Christian scriptures that says that the Messiah will come when Jews are dispersed throughout the whole world. Because Jews have been found in South America, it is now in the teachings of the Christian church that Jews are now dispersed all over the known world. This is a very propitious time to make the religious argument that if Jews are not in Britain, the Messiah will not come. You have got to have Jews in England for the Messiah to come. So Manasseh ben Israel is making this argument. God has promised to the people of the Jews concerning their restoration and their returning to their own land, according to the words of the prophet Daniel, when the scattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all the things shall be fulfilled. That is, when Jews are scattered throughout the land, when they come home to every land, then the prophecy of Daniel, which is, of course, an apocalyptic prophet, again, very much revered in the land of the Old Testament. This is important. And then he says one more thing, and this is so clever. As also, our scattering, little by little, should be from one end of the earth to the other, as it is written in Deuteronomy 28:64. I conceived by end of the earth to be understood to be this island, meaning Britain. Now, what does he mean that Deuteronomy 28:64 means Britain? How can Deuteronomy 28 mean Britain? That's ridiculous. Well, if you read the Hebrew is Deuteronomy 28:64, look it up. In Hebrew is Katsei Haaretz, which means that the Jews will be scattered from one end of the earth to the other. Katsei Haaretz, the end of the earth. If you translate Katsei Haaretz into French, do you know what it is? Angleterre, ends of the earth. Katsei Haaretz, Angleterre. So in French or in Dutch, the term in Deuteronomy that's used for scattering to the ends of the earth is the word England or Angleterre.
Wonderful.
So Manasseh ben Israel is playing with everybody's, bête noire and trying to get everyone to agree that this is a really good idea that Jews should live in England. Back to you, Dick.
Yeah, if I have my Christian theology right, which I probably don't, I believe Christians thought that the Messiah has come, and there was no need to wait around. Do I have that right or wrong? Was Christ treated as the Messiah?
Second coming. Second coming.
I see. So there was. So part of the tradition was to wait for a second coming.
Yeah, and this was what's called the millennial.
That's right.
The millennialism. Is that right, Jane? Millennial. If I got the right word. Yep. Millennialism. So this is the idea.
Yeah, and there's a whole strand in Christianity, and it sort of weaves its way in and out depending on the time in history. Sometimes in history, this belief in the second coming and focus on it is really intense in Christianity, and then it kind of goes underground and then it resurfaces.
Interesting.
It's happening in New England at the same time. We're getting what's called the Great Awakening. This is happening across the world, and the 17th century is considered to be a time when the second coming will come about. Manasseh ben Israel is buying into this, whether he believed it or whether he was making it up. We don't know, but this is where the end of the story, and I'm going to be very brief now because we're coming to the end of our time. The end of the story is very mysterious. We are not entirely sure what happens next. Did Oliver Cromwell agree to the Jews should come back and be restored to England? Did he feel he had the prerogative to do that, even though they were expelled on a royal edict? Parliament was not consulted. There is no parliamentary legislation. There is a Council of State that Oliver Cromwell calls, and on the day in which they are supposed to decide the fate of this petition that comes from Manasseh ben Israel, the page of the Council of State in the Book of Records has gone missing. That page no longer exists. It's been cut out. Nobody knows why or where that page is or what was said on that page. The only thing we know is that by 1666, there is a Jewish community in London. There is a synagogue and there is a graveyard, a cemetery that has been opened. But somehow Jews have been allowed back in England. It doesn't seem to have been by some, great edicts that someone decided, and that it's been allowed and everything has been overturned from 1290. But somehow some things worked out that Jews were allowed back in and that they were free to open themselves up as a Jewish community, not just as conversos, as hidden merchants. And what's so funny about this whole story is that Manasseh ben Israel does not get to benefit because he leaves disappointed from England and dies on the way back to Amsterdam. So he never sees the outcome of his good work. And it's Charles II, who is a king, who overturns the Commonwealth, comes back to Britain as a royal king, and says nothing about the Jews. Now, he had a couple of choices. He could have said, look, my ancestors got rid of the Jews, we'll get rid of them again. He didn't say that. He could have said, look, Oliver Cromwell was an upstart and the Commonwealth was a illegal regime, and everything they said they would do, we'll get rid of that as well. He didn't do that either. He said nothing about the Jews. He let them prosper to the point where a beautiful synagogue was created. This is the Bevis-Mark Synagogue in London. You can go there now. It's the oldest existing synagogue in London. It's modeled after the synagogue in Amsterdam. So the beginnings of the community in London was based on the Dutch Jewish existence. So the first prayer book printed in England was in Dutch and Hebrew. I've seen a copy of that. It's not in English. It's in Dutch and Hebrew. It's a Sephardi community. They are complying with Sephardi customs. So the Ark has multiple Sefer Torah, not the kind of Sefer Torah that we have, with rolls, but it's kept in a Sephardi shell. You've seen Sephardi Torahs that are they're kept in if you like, a casket. And they are huge, and there would have been at least 35, 40, 50 Sefer Torahs in this ark, and there are today if you go to Bevis-Mark Synagogue in London. So it's candlelit. If you go on Tisha B'Av, which, as we know now, is the day on which the Jews were expelled, they will light all the candles. They will drape the ark in black. They will sit on low stools, and they will recite the Book of Lamentations in Portuguese. They still sing Portuguese in the synagogue, and you will not recognize any of the Hebrew songs in the synagogue. They are all Sephardi melodies, no Ashkenazi melodies. They consider Ashkenazi beneath them. So this is the current story. At the 350th anniversary of the restoration of Jews coming back to Britain, that is in 2005, we invited Prince Charles, as he was then, to come to the Rabbinic Seminary in London. My daughter Anya gave him a bouquet of flower, and I welcomed him at the steps of the Rabbinic Seminary, and we presented him with a book of Hebrew manuscripts detailing his ancestors' edicts of Jews in Anglo Jewry in the medieval time, and it was full circle of Anglo Jewry.
Wow.
So we have come to 1656, the restoration of Jews to Britain, and next week we'll talk what happens in the 350 years from then until today.
Rabbi, could I ask you about one slide earlier with the tree of life?
Slide earlier, tree of life. This
There.
one.
Could you explain the blackbird there?
Oh,
Give me a minute, I'll look it up. Are there any other questions that maybe you want to ask?
I was going to ask about the novel, The Weight of Ink, which is set at this very moment, and which I really enjoyed, but I'm wondering if it is true to the history. It's consistent with a lot of the things you just said.
Very much so. Very much so. Actually, Ivanhoe as well. I mean, I know it's a romantic story, but the medieval feudal world of chivalry and Jews, being in the middle of arguments between all kinds of power brokers is very true to life. And that's going to be the difference between the medieval world and the modern world. Jews are no longer going to sit by and let other people have control of them. We're going to see a very different Jewish community in Britain from 1650 onwards, almost to the point where we are so pushy that we're not going to stand for it anymore. And it's amazing how quickly Jews integrate into British life. So by the basically within 50 years of Jews having returned to Britain, we have a Jew in Parliament. We only 100 years later, we have a Jewish prime minister. We have the richest Jews in Britain are aristocrats living in huge country houses, the richest people in the country. It's a real change about, and of course that's continued to this day. I'm still looking for that page 76. Sorry. It's the tree of life. It's the symbol of wisdom, and the image shows the tree filled with birds. And it's from 1280. That's all I can tell you, Bob.
yeah, it is a little curious. Bob's a bird lover, and it is curious that one black bird doesn't fit into the rest of the.
Yeah. Well, it kind of goes with the theme of the evening, does it?
Rabbi, I always use the word crypto, not converso. Is crypto considered jargon rather than converso?
Jane seems to have some thoughts on this. Do you have a view on that? I don't really know what's better these days.
Crypto Jews is used by some. I've been reading, not recently, but read some things about the hidden and now no longer hidden Jews of New Mexico here in the U.S. And the word crypto Jews is used there. I think it depends on the historians these days. Historians are never unanimous. And are always these days especially arguing about language, but it's not, I don't think crypto Jews is used in a derogatory way, but I wouldn't swear to it. And I think conversos sounds like the most reasonable and accurate word to use. I think the word the rabbi's using is, but crypto Jews does get used. I think it depends on the book and the school, and so that's about as much as I can.
Thank you, Jane. Maybe Rabbi Ken, do you have any knowledge of this period or South American Jews?
I don't know the terminology which is more accepted historically, and I don't know that they're synonymous. So That's a careful point. But I did want to bring up one thing when you talked a little bit about shaving of coins, that the American coinage responded to that practice, because if you look at a dime and a quarter, all of them have little ridges on the edges. And that was to make sure that no one was shaving off any of the silver in the early American coinage. And then as looking at nickels and pennies, their value was too small for nickel or copper, and no one bothered to shave them. But the dimes and quarters were silver, and certainly the silver dollar.
That's right. It's called milling on the edge, and that's what it's for, if you ever wondered why. Thank you for that. It's very, very interesting.
Well, this has been fascinating, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We'll come back next week. There'll be less murder and pillage. And
and happily ever after.
Death and destruction.
I thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.